The vows were folded in my jacket pocket when she said it. It was a Thursday evening, 2 days before the wedding. We were at her apartment finishing the last details. The gift list to check at the door, the car schedule, the final confirmation with the catering company. Practical things. The things of two people organizing an event that starts in 48 hours. And then, without warning, while I was checking an email on my phone, she said, "Rodrigo, we still haven't settled the honeymoon." I looked up from my phone. "What do you mean?" "We agreed on Fernando de Noronha. Everything is reserved." "Yes, but my cousin went to Italy and her Instagram." "I want Italy, Rodrigo. Rome, Amalfi, Florence." I stared at her. "Isabella, the flight is bought. The inn is paid for. It's 2 days away." "I know, but we can cancel and use the travel insurance. You can afford Italy. Your new project closed. You told me." "Isabella? Or we cancel the wedding." Those words stayed in the air for too long. Not in the dramatic sense you see in films, where the character freezes, the camera closes on the face, the music rises. It was quieter than that. It was the quiet of a room where the air had just changed composition. "You're giving me an ultimatum," I said. "I'm being honest about what I need to get married happy." I looked at her. At that face I'd been looking at for 3 years, thinking I understood what was underneath it. And I realized I didn't. "My name is Rodrigo Almeida. I'm 34 years old. I was born and raised in Porto Alegre, in the south of Brazil. I graduated in civil engineering from UFRGS, with the kind of effort my father still describes as the most tense period in the family. Not because I was a poor student, but because we didn't have money to spare, and every semester represented a careful equation of scholarships, part-time work, and the budget management my mother operated like someone navigating difficult water. My father, Mr. Antonio, worked 32 years as a machine operator at a metallurgy plant in the interior of Rio Grande do Sul. A man of few words and wide hands who taught me that life has its own rhythm and that trying to rush what isn't ready is the fastest way to break something. My mother, Donna Maria, was an elementary school teacher for my entire childhood. She taught me that debt isn't a synonym for failure. It's a tool, and a tool used without discipline becomes a trap. I grew up well, not rich. Well, a family that has enough and knows the value of enough. I moved to São Paulo at 28 to work at a construction company. I moved up quickly, enjoyed what I did, and 2 years later opened my own consulting firm for infrastructure projects. Small, solid, growing at the right pace. I'm not rich, but I built something honest with honest work. I met Isabella at a friend's party in 2021. She's from São Paulo, daughter of a comfortable upper-middle-class family from the Morumbi neighborhood. Her father is a dentist with his own practice. Her mother was a university professor who retired early. 2 siblings, all 3 raised without significant material difficulty, with summer vacations and private school. Isabella is an interior designer. She has her own studio that does well. Not extraordinary, but consistent. She has refined taste for everything. Knows the names of the architects that matter. Understands the difference between one material and another, and has that ability to create environments that make people feel like they're inside an idea. When I met her, I thought the difference in our origins was just that. a difference in origin. That what mattered was what a person builds, not where they start. She seemed to think the same. In the early months, she talked a lot about independence, about not wanting to depend on anyone, about building her own things. It took me time to notice the gap between what she said about independence and how she actually related to money in practice. The first signs were small, and I treated them as small because I wanted them to be small. In the 5th month of dating, Isabella and I went to Buzios for a weekend. Costs split evenly, as we'd always agreed. On the way back, she mentioned in passing, "Next time it can be a little more luxurious, right?" That inn was kind of basic. "It was nice," I said. "It was what we'd agreed to spend." "Yes, but you earn more than I do. Wouldn't it be fair for you to cover more?" I let it go. I thought, she's right that I earn more, and there's logic in the idea of proportional contribution. It's not absurd. 6 months later, her credit card came with a bill she couldn't pay. She asked me to lend her the equivalent of $400. "Temporary, Rodrigo. I'll pay you back when Project X closes." I lent it. Project X closed. The money never came back. When I mentioned it, "Oh, but that money was kind of already embedded in the costs I've covered for us in the last few months, wasn't it? It's a compensation." It wasn't. But I'd been dating for a year, I was in love, and I chose not to turn that into an argument about numbers. That pattern repeated in variations over the following 2 years. Never large enough to be an immediate crisis. Always justified by a logic that, examined in isolation, had some surface reasonableness. Always accompanied by something that made demanding accountability feel like pettiness on my part. Gradually, without any explicit agreement, without my conscious consent, I had become the default financier of the relationship. The engagement happened in March of last year. I proposed at a restaurant in Pinheiros we'd been going to since the beginning. Simple, real, no performance. She said yes with a joy that seemed to come from a genuine place. I believed her. I believed that joy was real. But what happened afterward made me understand that what she was celebrating and what I was celebrating weren't exactly the same thing. The day after the engagement, she called her mother, and the conversation, which I overheard partially because we were in the same room, included phrases like, "Yes, Mom, he has the company now. It's doing well. We'll be able to have a big party." Not, "We're getting married. We'll be able to have a big party." I chose not to put weight on that phrase. I was naive. The 6 months of wedding planning were the most exhausting of my life. Not physically, in the sense that each stage revealed a new layer of what was being negotiated without my knowing it was a negotiation. The venue she chose cost double what I'd estimated for the total event budget. "But Rodrigo, it's our wedding. We're not getting married again." The catering company she wanted was the most expensive of the 3 we visited. Cheap is expensive in the long run. The service at that other one was terrible. The photographer she hired, without consulting me, charged a fee that took me 2 months to type into my company's accounting system without a physical reaction of discomfort. When I asked why she'd contracted without discussing, "You'd think it was expensive, but this is an investment in memories, Rodrigo. You won't regret it." In each decision, there was the same logic embedded. You can afford it, therefore it's your obligation. Never stated directly, always wrapped in a narrative of love, of memory, of it being a once-in-a-lifetime event. And I, because I loved her, or had convinced myself I did, paid. The initial budget I'd established, responsible, not compromising the reserves I needed to expand the company, had been nearly doubled over the course of the planning. Each time I tried to set a limit, there was a reaction. Sometimes tears, sometimes 2 days of silence. Sometimes a variation of the argument that if I truly loved her, I'd be able to do this for her. It worked. Each time it worked, she learned that it worked. The honeymoon was the last major expense. Fernando de Noronha isn't cheap, but it was what I'd calculated as viable without compromising what needed to be preserved financially. I'd booked early, gotten good rates, planned carefully. On Thursday night, 2 days before the wedding, she told me she wanted Italy. That either I paid for Italy or the wedding wasn't happening. That ultimatum was different from the ones before. The previous ones were requests with emotional pressure behind them. This was declared. Clear. I'm giving you a deadline, and if you don't meet it, we don't get married. That sentence changed something in me. Not explosively, coldly. Like when you're walking in a forest and realize the ground ahead of you is no longer solid. I need to think, I said. Rodrigo, I need to think. I'm going to sleep at my apartment tonight. She watched me. She hadn't expected that. I picked up my car keys and left. I drove for an hour with no particular destination. São Paulo at night is a city that never stops, and sometimes that's what you need, to be in motion, surrounded by motion, while you try to stop moving internally. I thought about many things in that hour. I thought about the money I'd lent that never came back, about the catering that cost double, about the photographer hired without consultation, about Buzios being too basic, about every small architecture of pressure that had worked because I'd let it work. And I thought about something my father said once, when I was a teenager, complaining about a friend who was always asking things of me. Rodrigo, we teach people how to treat us. If you accept it, you're teaching them it's acceptable. I had taught Isabella that it was acceptable. Every time I paid without questioning, I was teaching. Every time I swallowed a veiled ultimatum, I was teaching. Every time I chose short-term peace over a necessary boundary, I was teaching. And she had learned well. The problem wasn't Italy. The problem was what Italy revealed with the clarity the other demands had let me avoid seeing. I called Caio at 11 at night. Caio is my best friend since university in Porto Alegre. Best man for the wedding. The kind of friend you call when you need someone who will tell you the truth without being asked. I'm driving. Need to talk. Where are you? On the Beltway? Get off the Beltway and come to my apartment. I went. We got there past midnight. I had 3 coffees I didn't need while I told him everything. Not just Thursday's ultimatum, but the complete history. The loan that wasn't repaid. The photographer. The budget doubled every time I'd found a justification not to see what was being built. Caio listened in silence for a long time, which is rare for him. When I finished, he said, Rodrigo, are you going to marry this woman after what you just told me? I'm still trying to understand what I feel. Then let me tell you what I'm feeling, because sometimes it's easier to hear from the outside. What you described isn't a relationship with some financial difficulties. It's a pattern. And patterns don't change by osmosis. They change when the person being treated that way stops accepting it. I was quiet. A marriage is a structure that will last decades. Are you willing to live inside that structure for decades? I didn't answer. I slept on Kayo's couch. Friday morning, I did 3 things. First, I called Isabella and said I was fine, that I needed space to think, that the conversation we needed to have would happen, but not yet. Second, I called my father. Third, I went for a 2-hour walk in Ibirapera Park. The conversation with my father was short, as the important ones with him tend to be. Dad, I need advice. Tell me. I gave him the essentials. Not all the details. Enough for him to understand the structure. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Son, do you know how to swim? Yes, Dad. Why? Because when you get into a river that's pulling you down, you have 2 options. You swim or you let it take you. The river doesn't stop pulling because you asked it to. My father's metaphor was worth more than any advice I could have received. On Saturday, the day of the wedding, I woke up at 6 in the morning on Kayo's couch. I hadn't slept well. I'd spent the night between the clarity that came in waves and the resistance that always arrives alongside clarity when you know that acting is going to cost you something. Because it was going to cost something. The venue was paid for. The catering was paid for. The photographer was paid for. Without my consultation, but paid for. There were 140 confirmed guests from both sides. There were flower arrangements in vans on the way to the venue at that very moment. There was a woman who had said she would marry me and who was expecting me to show up. And there were the vows I had written by hand, folded in my jacket pocket, that I'd spent 3 weeks revising, because I wanted them to be exact. I got dressed. I went to the wedding. Not because I had decided to get married, because I had decided the decision should be made in the right place. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 in the afternoon. I arrived at the venue, a salon in the Jardins neighborhood, exactly double my original budget estimate, immaculately decorated with flowers everywhere, and that lighting that makes any environment appear more special than it is. At 2 o'clock, Kayo was with me. While we waited, he showed me his phone. Rodrigo, I need you to see something. And I need you to see it before you go in. On the screen was a screenshot of an Instagram conversation. It was Isabella's, with a friend. I won't reproduce every word, but the meaning was clear. She had told the friend 2 weeks before the wedding that she was managing the finances of the relationship. That I was generous when you know how to ask. That Italy was just the last piece of what she'd planned for the honeymoon. And that after the wedding, there was a plan for me to help with a debt at her studio. A significant amount she'd never mentioned to me. There was a money emoji, and then, he'll understand when I explain how this is an investment in our future. I stared at the screen for a time I can't measure. Then I put the phone back in Kayo's hand. I breathed. I'm going in, I said. Kayo looked at me. Rodrigo. I'm going in, but I'm not getting married. I entered through the side corridor. The music was already playing. The guests were in their seats. On her side, family from Morumbi, friends from the studio. The same faces I'd seen at parties over the past 3 years. On my side, my father in the suit he'd bought 10 years ago that still fit. My mother, with that way she has, of being very still when she's proud. Kayo, right behind me. Isabella arrived through the main corridor. She was beautiful. That is a fact, and I won't falsify it because it's not relevant to the conclusion of this story. She was genuinely beautiful, in the dress she'd chosen without consulting me, wearing the smile I'd learned to read over 3 years. The officiant began. I stood, motionless, listening. When the vow moment came, the officiant turned to me. I put my hand in my jacket pocket. I felt the folded paper of the vows I'd written. I took them out. I unfolded them. I looked at them. And then I tore them. It wasn't an angry gesture. It wasn't theatrical. Or at least, not intentionally. It was the most physically honest thing I could do in that moment. What I'd written was no longer true, and I couldn't pretend it was. The silence that fell over the venue was the kind you never forget. Isabella stared at me with an expression I'd never seen on her before. Not sadness, not surprise. Or at least not just surprise. Something that took me time to name. It was recognition. The recognition of being seen. I turned to the guests. All 140 pairs of eyes were on me. I spoke with a calm I hadn't planned. It came from the same place as the calm on Thursday night, from somewhere below thought. I apologize to everyone for being here today and being brought to this moment, especially to both families who have nothing to do with what I'm about to say. Pause. On Thursday night, 2 days before this wedding, my fiancé gave me an ultimatum. Pay for a trip that wasn't in our planning, or the wedding would be cancelled. Isabella closed her eyes. That ultimatum wasn't the first. It was the most direct. In the 3 years we spent together, I learned to recognize a pattern I chose not to name because naming it would have meant acting on it. A few minutes ago, I was shown that this pattern wasn't just a way of relating to me. It was a strategy, planned and discussed with others. I turned to her. Isabella, I wish you well. Genuinely. But I can't marry someone who sees our wedding as a financial instrument. I turned toward the exit. Again, my apologies to everyone. I walked down the aisle alone. Kayo caught up with me outside. Neither of us said anything for a while. What happened afterward was complicated, as these things tend to be. Her father tried to approach me before I reached the car. Not with anger, with the expression of a man who was also being surprised. I don't know how much he knew of what had been planned. I didn't ask. I said it wasn't the moment and got into the car. My mother called me 30 minutes later. She'd stayed at the venue for about 20 minutes after I left, because someone sensible had to be there to close what needed closing. That was exactly her way. Are you okay? I am, Mom. You did right. I know. Your father knows too. He just doesn't know how to say it that way, but he was proud out there. That made me smile for the first time that day. In the days that followed, some things happened that seemed important to record. Isabella sent me messages. Many. In the first days, they were messages of anger and accusation. I had humiliated her publicly, had destroyed something that was real, had overreacted to a situation that could have been resolved another way. Then came quieter messages. One of them, which arrived 5 days later, was different in tone. It said she'd reflected, that she understood what I'd seen in the screenshot was real, and that she knew she'd crossed a line. I didn't respond, not as revenge, but because there was no response I could give that would represent any useful next step for either of us. Sometimes the most honest closure is silence. I want to talk about money directly, because I think it's important to say this clearly. Money wasn't the central problem, it was the symptom. The central problem was that Isabella had built a relationship with me where my resources were her standard of living and where my role was to maintain that standard without complaining and without questioning. And I had cooperated with that construction for 3 years, one unset boundary at a time. If I had said, the first time she described Buzios as too basic, Isabella, that was the inn we agreed on within our budget. If you want something different, that's a conversation we can have. But it starts with honesty about what each of us can and wants to contribute. If I had said that, maybe the story would be different. I'm not saying that with self-judgment. I am saying it with the honest recognition that we create the conditions for what happens next. But there's a limit to what is your responsibility and what is the other person's. I can take responsibility for not having set limits earlier. I cannot take responsibility for the fact that she, when given space, chose to build a financial extraction strategy and discuss it with friends using money emojis. That was hers. There's a question people ask me when I tell this story. But do you think she loved you? I've thought about that question a lot. My honest answer is, I don't know. I believe there was a real affection at some point. But love that coexists with the idea that the other person is a resource to be managed isn't complete love. It's affection with a layer of interest underneath. And when the interest becomes more legible than the affection, you have your answer. The question wasn't whether she loved me. The question was how she saw me, and how she saw me. If the Instagram messages were honest, and I had no reason to think they weren't, was as someone generous when you know how to ask. I don't want to be seen that way, not by anyone. Let me tell you about the vow writing process, because it matters for understanding what that paper represented. I started writing the vows 2 months before the wedding. I'd read that the standard advice is to write close to the date, when the emotion is most present. I did the opposite. Wrote early, let them rest. Came back, rewrote. In the first version, the vows were about her, about what I admired in her. The creativity, the visual sensibility, the way she transformed any space into something that felt considered. About what made me happy when we were together. About the future I imagined. In the second version, I realized something was wrong with the first. Not what it said, but what it omitted. 2 months into the engagement, the photographer episode had already happened. The tension about the catering had already started. There was already that "it's fine, we can do the first one" tone that I'd learned to recognize. And the first version's vows mentioned none of it. Not because I was pretending it didn't exist, but because I'd learned to separate the two. The love I felt for the person I imagined her to be, and the friction of what was actually being built. In the second version, I tried to include something about difficulty, about choosing each other even when it's hard, about real partnership, which includes the uncomfortable conversations. Isabella read the draft. I'd shared it and said, "It sounds too serious. Can it be lighter?" And I made it lighter. I look at that decision now and see it was symptomatic of the whole pattern. I'd written the truth. She'd asked me to make it lighter, and I'd made it lighter because it was easier than explaining why the truth needed to be there. The vows I tore were the light version, the version she had requested. When I tore that paper, I tore the concession I'd made not to include the whole truth. I want to talk about my parents because they appear a lot in my head when I think about this story. My father and mother have been together 40 years. It's not a perfect marriage. I've never witnessed a perfect marriage and suspect they don't exist. But it's a marriage where two people, over 40 years, have made financial decisions as a team, where neither has used money as currency for affection or control, where when there was difficulty, and there was multiple times, the conversation was, how do we solve this together? When I thought about what I wanted in a marriage, that was the architecture I had as reference. Not the house or the car or the vacation, the way of making decisions together. Isabella and I never made a financial decision together. I would decide, she would adjust. Or she would decide and I would agree to avoid the conflict. That wasn't partnership, it was something else. What happened when I entered that venue on that Saturday was this. I went through the side corridor as planned. I saw my father sitting on the left, the 10-year-old suit that still fit, hands in his lap. He saw me enter and made that minimal head gesture that over 40 years I've learned to translate as, I'm here. I saw my mother beside him. She had that expression she gets when she's containing something. Not necessarily sadness, but emotion she's managing because it's not the right time. I saw Kaio right behind me. I saw the guests, 140 people who had given up their Saturday to be here, who had bought outfits, who had bought gifts, 140 people who had nothing to do with any of this. I saw the Jardins venue, double my original budget, with the flowers she'd chosen and the lighting she'd arranged with the decorator without telling me until the following week. I saw Isabella, and while the officiant was speaking the opening words of the ceremony, I stood and took a very quick inventory of what was present. There was a physical structure: flowers, light, food, music. There was a human structure: guests, family, people who knew us. There was a paper structure: the contract the officiant was about to invite us to sign in front of everyone. And there was a reality. The woman in front of me had planned, with someone else, that the wedding was one piece in a larger project I wasn't aware of. There was no way to sign that contract. There was no way to read those vows. So I tore them. The moment after I tore the vows and began to speak was the quietest moment of my life. Not in the sense of external silence. There were murmurs, the sound of someone crying in one of the rows on her side, the noise of chairs being shifted. But internally, there was a stillness I hadn't felt in a long time, because I was telling the truth out loud. And truth, when it finally comes out, has that effect, not of immediate lightness, but of resolution, of something that was out of place returning to where it belongs. When I finished speaking and turned toward the exit, part of me was expecting someone to try to stop me, for someone to shout, for a scene. There wasn't one. I walked down the aisle and went outside. Kaio followed 30 seconds later. We stood in the parking lot without speaking for about 2 minutes. Then he said, "Do you want to get something to eat?" And I laughed. The way you laugh when something is absurd and real at the same time. Yes. We went to a bar nearby. Beer and basic food and the best conversation I'd had in a long time, because it was a conversation with no negotiation underneath it. My father called at 6 in the evening on that Saturday. "How are you?" I'm okay, Dad. You did right. I know. Silence on his end. My father's kind of silence, which contains a lot. Old Raimundo, back at the plant, always used to say, better to lose the ring than the finger. You lost the ring, but the finger's still there. My father is not a man of grand metaphors, but when he uses one, it stays. I want to talk about what's different in my life now, 8 months later. The company closed 2 major projects in the last 3 months. Not because anything changed in the quality of the work. The quality was always consistent, but because there's a mental clarity I didn't have before. When a significant portion of my cognitive resources was being consumed by managing a relationship that required constant emotional and financial negotiation. When you stop spending energy managing what shouldn't need to be managed, that energy goes somewhere else. In my case, it went to work, to projects, to client conversations that I used to conduct well, but now conduct with more presence. It's not that ending the engagement made me a better professional. It returned a capacity that had been gradually redirected. Something I didn't mention yet. What happened with the Maceo trip? After everything, I cancelled the Norona reservations, got partial refund. Worse than if I'd cancelled with more notice, but better than not cancelling. I would use that money as originally planned for the company. But the following month, my father called with an unexpected suggestion. Rodrigo, your mother has never been to the northeast coast. We never had the means to go. Would you have the ability to make that happen for us someday? I thought for about 2 seconds. When can you two go? Whenever you can. 2 months later, my parents and I spent a week in Mateo, not Noronha. Maceo is more accessible and, honestly, more beautiful than most people know. My mother saw the ocean for only the third time in her life. My father stood looking at the horizon with that expression he uses when he's storing something. On the last day sitting on the hotel room balcony watching the sun go down, my father said, "This is worth more than anything I've ever bought." He was talking about the trip, but I found myself thinking that it applied to some other choices too. Why I'm telling this story? Not to condemn anyone, not to publicly process something that should be private. Because what I've described, the pattern of veiled and declared ultimatums, of unilaterally made financial decisions, of money used as currency for affection, happens in varying forms in many relationships. And many people inside those patterns don't have access to an outside perspective. If you're in a relationship where setting a financial boundary is treated as proof that you don't love enough, that's not a sign you don't love enough. It's a sign your boundary is being used as leverage. If you're in a relationship where decisions involving both of you are made unilaterally and presented as accomplished facts, that's not initiative. That's control. If you're in a relationship where each refusal generates punitive silence, tears, or accusations of not loving, that's not emotional sensitivity. That's conditioning. I'm not describing your specific situation. I don't know your situation. But if any part of what I described resonates, it's worth examining more carefully. Because patterns that aren't named don't disappear. They become the structure of the relationship. And structures built on imbalance sooner or later collapse. Better to collapse early, when there's still space to build something different. I'm ending where I began, with the vows in my jacket pocket. That folded paper was the most honest thing I'd produced about the relationship. Not in the final version, not in the lighter version she'd requested, but in the original intention. in the second draft I'd written before making it lighter. In that version, there was a line I'd deleted at her request. I promised to be present in the difficult conversations, not just the easy ones. I promise to be honest when something isn't right, because honesty is a form of respect. I prefer to a comfort built on silence. She had said it sounded like reservations. That vows shouldn't sound like reservations. They weren't reservations. They were a vision of marriage, a vision I still hold, and that I'll put into practice when I find someone who shares it. Without ultimatums, without accomplished facts, without money emojis in Instagram conversations, just the non-light version of two people building something together. That's the marriage I want, and that I'll have. Like and subscribe if this story stayed with you. Until the next one. Script registry, mention Vows N, AB01, EN06, CF07, TE05, RV06, DS06, RT05, PN04, DP07, MD03, PC02, CC07, GE05, DD02, CE04, TT01, NA03, EP05, RM04, RO03, CV04, TC03, EC02 sensory anchor, folded paper of vows in the jacket pocket, plus flower smell in the venue. Semantic field, resource, manage, generous, fund, ultimatum, structure, pattern, instrument. Narrator, Rodrigo Almeida, 34, civil engineer, consultant, São Paulo characters. Mr. Antonio, father, machine operator. Dona Maria, mother, teacher. Isabella, fiancé, designer. Caio, best friend, best man. Let me tell you more about the 6 months of planning, because the story isn't just the altar. The altar was the conclusion of something built brick by brick over a long time. When we got engaged, the first major decision was the venue. Isabella had been researching for weeks. She presented me with 3 options, one evening, over dinner at her apartment. The first was a space in a neighborhood slightly outside the center. Nice, functional, within the ceiling I'd established. The second was a salon in the Jardins neighborhood. Double the cost, but with a covered garden that she described as exactly the atmosphere I always imagined. The third was a historic house in another neighborhood, outside my ceiling and outside our agreed budget entirely. "I prefer the Jardins one," she said. "It costs double what we discussed." "I know, but look at the difference." She showed me the photos. That first one is generic. This second one has personality, and you have the ability to cover it. Your new project is going to close before the wedding. You said so yourself. The project closing is to expand the company, Isabella, not to double the wedding budget. She went quiet for a while. Then she said, "It's fine. We can do the first one then." In that tone that isn't fine. It's the tone of someone registering a disappointment for future reference. The following week, she showed me an updated cost estimate she'd calculated. In the document, the Jardins venue was listed, not the other one. When I asked, "Oh, I called to confirm the availability of the first one, and it was already reserved for our date. The Jardins one was available. I signed before it was gone too." She'd signed it, without consulting me. The commitment was made. Isabella. "Rodrigo, it's our wedding. I wasn't going to let the date slip because of hesitation." It wasn't hesitation. It was a decision that needed to be made by both of us. But the contract was signed, and undoing it would mean a significant cancellation fee. I paid for the Jardins venue. The photographer was the second time I saw the pattern more clearly, and ignored it again. Isabella had pointed out a photographer she'd referenced on her Instagram several times. Beautiful portfolio, undeniably good work. What he charged was the equivalent of 3 months of my rent. I said it was expensive. She said expensive is relative and memory is priceless. I said there were other excellent photographers for less. She said I was bargain hunting at our own wedding. It sat there for a few days. Then she arrived one Sunday with a printed contract, already signed by her. I finalized with the photographer. He had a window this month to confirm November clients, and I wasn't going to let it pass. I looked at the contract. I looked at her. You finalized a contract for an amount I said I thought was high without consulting me. I knew you'd agree once you saw his work. This way, it's better than losing the date. Isabella, this isn't about the photographer. It's about making a financial decision that involves both of us without consulting the other person. You're being dramatic. I wasn't being dramatic. I was naming something real. But she said I was being dramatic with such conviction that for a moment I hesitated. Was I? I wasn't. But I was tired of fighting about each thing. There was an emotional cost to those fights that I couldn't manage alongside the company, the projects, everything else. So I paid for the photographer. The pattern, which I only saw clearly when I told everything to Kayo that night, always worked the same way. Isabella would choose what she wanted, never the cheaper option, always the most expensive, or the second most expensive, with the argument that the most expensive was unjustifiable even to her. Then there would be a negotiation period where I'd resist. Then she'd take unilateral action, sign, confirm, deposit. That made unwinding costly. And then she'd present the accomplished fact as an inevitable decision. Each time I paid after the accomplished fact, I was signaling that the method worked. And it worked because it worked. It was an elegant system. I don't say that with admiration. I say it with the recognition that it requires planning and consistency. What I took time to understand is that it doesn't matter whether a strategy is conscious or unconscious. The result is the same. You end up paying what you didn't plan to pay, accepting decisions you didn't make, living inside a budget that isn't yours. I want to talk about Thursday's ultimatum from a different angle. When she said, "Pay for Italy or we cancel the wedding," there was something in the clarity of it that was paradoxically a relief. Because the veiled ultimatums are harder to name. The 2 days of silence after a refusal. The tear that arrives when you set a limit. The "it's fine, we can do the first one" in that tone of registered disappointment. These things are real, painful, and ambiguous enough that you can always attribute them to another cause if you want to. The declared ultimatum had no ambiguity. It was the first time in 3 years she said exactly what she was saying. Without code, without emotional packaging, without space for me to convince myself I'd misunderstood. And in that clarity, I was finally able to see the entire pattern. Like when you've been looking at an image you don't understand and it suddenly resolves into something recognizable. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. She had given me, without intending to, the gift of a clear line. That night at Kayo's, after 3 coffees and the most honest conversation I'd had with anyone about that relationship, he said something that stayed with me. "Rodrigo, you're an engineer. You spend your whole day calculating loads, tensions, safety margins. You instinctively know when a structure is being overloaded beyond what it can hold. How did you spend 3 years inside a structure that was clearly being overloaded?" I've thought about that question a lot. The answer I arrived at is this. In engineering, structures don't complain. They simply collapse when they reach their limit. But in relationships, the structure that's giving way sometimes tells you everything is fine. Sometimes it tells you you're being difficult. Sometimes it tells you love means absorbing the load without complaining. I believed those messages more than I should have. Kayo didn't come to a version of the story where he showed me something neutral. He had found the screenshot the previous afternoon. He'd spent hours with it before deciding what to do. When he told me this, I asked him what had made him decide to show me. I thought about every possible version, he said, including the one where I don't show you, you get married, you find out some other way 6 months from now, and I'm the friend who knew and said nothing. That version doesn't work for me. That's what a real friend looks like in a specific, unglamorous moment. Not the support offered at the right time over beers. The decision made alone, at a cost, to tell you something that will change your day, possibly your life, in ways that can't be undone. I owe Kayo a lot for that decision, not in any transactional sense. In the sense that a piece of the future I'm going to have is shaped by his choice to tell me the truth when he had the option to stay quiet. Some of the guests from her side, not family, but friends, messaged me afterward. Not to take sides, not to attack me, to say they were surprised, that they hadn't known, that they wished me well. One of them, an architect I'd met at a dinner of hers, said something specific. Rodrigo, I don't know exactly what happened, but I've known Isabella for years, and I know she has a way of operating that's not easy to be on the inside of. I hope you're okay. I don't know what he knew, but that phrase told me something. What I had experienced as invisible, as deniable, as possibly my own overcorrection, was perfectly visible to people on the outside. They'd simply stayed quiet, out of respect or not wanting to intrude. That's understandable. But it creates a situation where the person on the inside is the last to see clearly. There's something specific about the morning I walked in Ibirapuera that I want to describe. It was just after 7. The park was already filling with the Saturday runners, the dog walkers, the weekend families with strollers. São Paulo's Ibirapuera at morning has this particular quality. It's the closest the city comes to admitting that somewhere underneath all the concrete and traffic and urgency, there's something that moves at a different pace. I walked for almost 2 hours. No podcast, no music, just the sounds of the park and my own thinking. At some point, maybe an hour in, I stopped at the edge of the lake and looked at the water. There was a family of ducks near the bank. Someone's dog was pulling toward them with the energy of an animal who has never once considered the possibility that a duck might not want to be chased. I stood there for probably 5 minutes without thinking about anything in particular. And in those 5 minutes, something settled. Not a decision. The decision had already been made, even if I hadn't fully named it yet. More like an acceptance. The acceptance that some things that look like endings are actually the correct place for a story to conclude. That there's a difference between a story that was cut short and one that reached its natural end. What I had with Isabella had reached its natural end on Thursday night. The Saturday ceremony was just where I was going to say so out loud. My mother's call, later that Saturday. She'd stayed at the venue for 20 minutes after I left. I asked her once what had happened in those 20 minutes. Not much, she said. People didn't know where to go. The catering staff started offering appetizers because they didn't know what else to do. Isabella's mother was crying. Her father was on his phone. Some of the guests started leaving. The flowers just kept being flowers. I've thought about that image. The flowers just kept being flowers, more than I would have expected. There was something right about it. The flowers had been arranged without knowing what they were arranged for. They didn't have stakes in the outcome. They were just doing what flowers do, existing in whatever room they'd been placed in. The rest of us, all 140 of us, plus the ones who cried and the ones who took photos on their phones, had stakes. We'd all shown up with expectations, with investments of time and effort and emotion. The only participants with no expectations were the flowers. Sometimes I think the flowers had the right idea. 8 months out. Here is what I know. I know that the thing I described, a relationship where one person's financial resources become the other person's standard of living, where that arrangement is maintained through emotional leverage rather than explicit agreement, is common. It happens in variations across many relationships, across many income levels, across many combinations of gender and background. The specific form it took with Isabella and me had particular features, but the underlying structure, use what you know about what the person needs from you as leverage to get what you need from them, is something a lot of people recognize when they hear it described. If you're hearing this and recognizing something, you're not being oversensitive. You're not misreading the situation. If setting a financial boundary in your relationship consistently produces emotional consequences designed to make you feel that you don't love enough, that pattern has a name, and it doesn't require extreme cases to be real. Name it to yourself first. Then, if there's openness to the person you're with, the conversation might be difficult. The conversation might reveal something you'd rather not know. But the alternative, not having it, until the thing you'd rather not know arrives at an altar, is worse. The last thing I want to say is about the vows themselves. They exist, in the version I tore, in about 47 pieces on a venue floor in the Jardins neighborhood. Someone swept them up. They're in a trash bag somewhere in São Paulo. They've decomposed by now, or will soon. But the words themselves, the specific sentences I spent 3 weeks choosing, remain accessible to me. I know what I wrote. I know what I meant. And I know that some version of those words, when they find the right time and the right person, is going to be read without being torn. Not because I've lowered my expectations, because I've raised my clarity about what I'm looking for. Someone who makes financial decisions as a team, who, when there's difficulty, asks, how do we solve this together, rather than, how do I get him to pay for this? Who sees a boundary not as a sign of insufficient love, but as a form of respect. That person exists. I'm not in a hurry. I'm in a good place. And the vows are ready. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment telling me what you would have done. I read everyone. Until the next story. Let me tell you about the conversation I had with Caio in more detail, because it was the conversation that made everything else possible. We sat in his apartment until about 3 in the morning. At some point after the second coffee, he said something I've thought about many times since. Rodrigo, can I ask you something that might be uncomfortable? Go ahead. Were you happy in the relationship? Not on the good days, on the ordinary days. I sat with that for a long moment. I think I was managing, I said finally. Managing is not the same as happy. No, it isn't. What were you managing? The dynamic, the calibration of how much to resist and when to let things go. The energy required to avoid certain conversations. The math of what it would cost emotionally versus what it would cost to just agree. He was quiet. That sounds exhausting, he said. It was. I didn't know that it was while I was doing it. You don't always notice the weight of something until you put it down. That's one of the things I know now that I didn't fully know at the time. I had been operating for 2 years in a state of chronic low-level management, managing the relationship the way you manage a complicated project at work, always thinking 3 steps ahead, always calibrating, always accounting for what happens if you push here versus there. That's not what a relationship is supposed to feel like. A relationship, a good one, the kind I want, is supposed to feel like the opposite. Like a place where you can stop calculating and just be. Where the other person's presence is a resource, not a variable to be managed. The closest I get to that feeling is when I'm with my parents, or with Kayo, or in the Ibirapuera Park at 7 in the morning. I want a romantic relationship that feels like that. Here's something about the financial pattern that I think is worth naming precisely. The approach Isabella used. And I want to be careful here, because I genuinely believe she may not have been fully conscious of it. Had a specific mechanism. It worked in 3 steps. First, she would identify what she wanted, which was consistently more expensive than whatever we'd agreed on. Second, she would create a situation where the more expensive option was the path of least resistance. Sometimes this was by making an emotional argument. Sometimes it was by unilaterally committing to the expensive option and presenting the accomplished fact. Sometimes it was by using future events. Your project is going to close as justification for current spending. Third, once I'd paid, the baseline shifted. Whatever I'd paid became the new normal. The next request would start from there. Over 3 years, that mechanism escalated the baseline of what normal spending looked like in the relationship significantly. The key insight is this: the mechanism doesn't require the person using it to be consciously malicious. It can be the product of someone who grew up in an environment where resources were always provided when needed, who learned that expressing a strong enough preference produces results, and who genuinely doesn't see the difference between asking and expecting. But the result? A relationship where one person's financial agency is gradually eroded is the same regardless of whether the mechanism is conscious or not. This is why naming it matters, even when the other person insists they didn't mean it that way. The meaning matters less than the pattern. My father visited São Paulo for the first time in a long while last month. He doesn't love São Paulo. Too big, too loud, too much of everything for someone who grew up where the noise is tractors and weather. But he came, and we spent a weekend together. On Saturday afternoon, I took him to see the Ibirapuera Park. He walked through it with the careful attention of someone evaluating something, not impressed or unimpressed, just observing. At one point, he stopped at a spot near the lake and looked out at the water. "This is where you walked," he said. "Yes." He nodded. We kept walking. Later, over dinner, he said, "I'm glad you walked that morning instead of driving. Driving when you're working something out like that. You don't think the same way. Your feet on the ground does something different." My father is not a man who reads self-help books. He has never been to therapy. What he knows, he learned from 32 years of showing up and from a father before him who showed up in similar ways. Sometimes the accumulated wisdom of people who learn through doing is more precise than anything you can find in a book. I want to add one more thing about what was in the Instagram screenshot, because I've described it in general terms and I think the specific detail matters. The money emoji was there, and what came after it. He'll understand when I explain how this is an investment in our future, contained a specific structure that I want to name. The phrase implies that my understanding of the situation was incomplete, and that when she completed it for me, I would agree. It treats my perspective, my assessment that this wasn't something I wanted to fund, as a temporary misapprehension that would be corrected through her explanation. It doesn't leave space for the possibility that I understood correctly and disagreed. That's a specific kind of disrespect, not the violent kind, not the obvious kind. The kind that presents your own assessment of reality as the only valid one and treats the other person's assessment as a deficit to be corrected. I had experienced versions of this throughout the relationship. You'd think it was expensive, but you'll see once I explain, you're not seeing the full picture yet. Each of those phrases positions me as someone whose judgment about my own resources and priorities is provisional pending her correction. I don't want to live inside that dynamic. The last thing I'll say about the money side of things. Being the person who pays doesn't have to be a problem. In relationships where the income is genuinely asymmetrical, and both people have explicitly agreed on an arrangement, the person who earns more often paying more is reasonable and fair. The problem in my relationship wasn't that I paid more. It was that I paid more than I had agreed to, for things I hadn't approved, within a framework that was never explicitly discussed, only assumed, and then gradually expanded. The difference between those two things, explicit agreement and gradual assumption, is enormous, and it's easy to miss because gradual assumption works precisely by not being explicit. It operates in the space between what's said and what's expected. If you're in a relationship and you're not sure which one you're in, have the explicit conversation. Put it in words. See if the two of you can agree on a framework in actual language. If the conversation is possible, you're probably in a relationship with a foundation. If the conversation is treated as an accusation, as evidence of insufficient trust, or as somehow beneath the relationship, that's information. Act on that information while you still have a choice. I am at peace with where I am. Not because everything resolved cleanly. There was messiness. There were awkward conversations with mutual friends. There were weeks when I replayed the events, trying to find the moment when things could have gone differently. But peace isn't the absence of complicated feelings. It's the presence of a clear sense of direction. And I have that now. I know what I'm looking for. I know what I'm not willing to accept. I know the difference between a concession made from love and a concession made from exhaustion, and I'm no longer willing to mistake one for the other. The vows I tore were written by someone who was already exhausted, who had been managing for 2 years and didn't fully know it, who made the vows lighter when they should have been heavy, because heavy was too risky. The next vows will be heavier. The version without the edits. The version that says, I'm going to tell you when something isn't right, because I respect you too much to be quiet about it. Those vows will find a person who receives them the way they're meant. I'm ready for that. Until next time.